organization to get lawyers together and non-lawyers who are legal minded people. So thank you all for coming. It's really our honor to again host the Federalist Society, which has been a great organization to partner with and host events. We're very excited tonight to have, as I noted, my very dear friend and recent new father, Josh Hammer, also a classmate of mine here, as well as, of course, Judge Altman, who's been beyond words in terms of his service to our community, and I think everyone knows what I mean by that, and we appreciate that. We all appreciate that from the bottom of our hearts. Dr. Cole, it's great to meet you and great to have you here. To learn more about Miami Jewish Legal Society programming, you can visit yjpmiami.com. And with that, I'll hand it over to FedSoc. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your attendance and participation in tonight's event. My name is Jordan Richardson, and together with Stephen Domanovich, I help lead the Miami chapter of the Federalist Society. Well, next year on July 4th, 2026, marks the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And tonight's topic is timely and important as we appreciate and trace the roots of America's founding. We're honored tonight to have an esteemed panel for this important discussion on the Jewish, Greek, and Roman influences on the Western legal tradition. In reviewing this topic and preparing for tonight's event, it was remarkable to see just how foundational these three civilizations were in shaping the principles that guide American law and government today. For example, President FDR said in a 1935 fireside chat, "We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible has occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic." Even the Liberty Bell, housed in Independence Hall in Philadelphia, bears an inscription directly from the Scripture. Leviticus 25:10, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all inhabitants thereof." And perhaps most relevant tonight, Jewish Scripture, along with Greek and Roman legal traditions, has long provided a model of what a good judge should be. Deuteronomy 16:20 commands, "Justice shall you pursue, that you may live and inherit the land which the Lord your God is giving you." Likewise, Deuteronomy 1:16 through 17 instructs, "Judge righteously between man and his brother, or the stranger who is with him. You shall not be partial in judgment. You shall hear the small and the great alike." And few embody these ideals more than our distinguished moderator tonight, Judge Roy Altman, and it is my honor to introduce him. On April 4th, 2019, Judge Altman was confirmed to a seat on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida. At the age of just 36 years old, he became the youngest federal district court judge in the country and the youngest ever appointed in his district. Judge Altman earned his BA from Columbia University, where he excelled not only in academics, but also in athletics, playing quarterback on the football team and pitching for the baseball team.
Is Columbia still accredited? I'm not sure.
I don't know. To check the news these days. After his wonderful service in Columbia, Judge Altman clerked on the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals for the Honorable Stanley Marcus before becoming a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Miami. We are incredibly fortunate tonight to have Judge Altman with us this evening and to share his insight on the foundational legal concepts that have shaped our country. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Judge Roy Altman.
All right, it's really nice to see everyone tonight. For whatever reason, nobody decided to sit up front. I guess people were afraid of Josh. Yeah, you guys, very brave. We know Josh. You know Josh. You know he's not that scary. I want to start with the questions. I'm not going to introduce the two speakers because you can look them up yourself, and I think we've got a lot to talk about. But I'd be remiss if I didn't note, as I did to many of you, that I just got back yesterday from a third judicial mission to Israel. I took 19 federal judges this time, and it was amazing. As I've told 3/4 of you, told you about the story of Ash Wednesday, And if you're in the 1/4 of you who haven't heard of the story, I just feel really badly for you. But you know, I was struck by so many things while we were there, and we're going to talk about some of it. What an incredible people they are, and how resilient and strong. And I'll just tell you a story that really resonated with me that I think should set a framework for our discussion. And that is that when you go to the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, it's a giant triangular building. And you start on one side, on the far left, and there's a screen in black and white that passes from right to left. And you see there all the rich diversity of Jewish life in Europe before the Holocaust. You see the Orthodox Polish Jews holding their little sons' hands on their way into shul. You see the secular Lithuanian Jews in a swimming meet, and the German Jews singing songs, and the Latvian and Estonian Jews dancing during the holidays. And then at the very end of the video, the last clip is of like 50 children, and their teachers are putting them in rows. And then the clip ends, and you don't know what they're getting in rows for. And then you walk through the entirety of that museum. It twists and it turns from the killing fields of Babi Yar to the ghetto in Warsaw to the death camps at Auschwitz and Dachau and Treblinka. And then you come out at the very, very end on the opposite side of the museum. In fact, when you're there, you can still turn around and see the video scrolling from right to left. And there, the last thing you see before you leave, does anybody know? It's a TV screen. And it's those 50 children again. And their teachers are there organizing them in rows. And you remember, 2 hours ago I saw this scene, and I didn't know what they were getting in rows for. But now you see, they're getting in rows to sing. And what do they sing? They sing Hatikva, the Jewish national anthem, the anthem of the Jewish people, the anthem of the modern Jewish state of Israel. And then you leave that room and you walk out through large glass doors, and where are you? Overlooking Jerusalem. Even to a dollard like me, the message is unambiguous. If there had been an Israel in 1939, those communities would have survived. If there had been a state of Israel in 1939, those little children set up in rows, all of whom perished in the Holocaust, they would have lived. And I tell you this because I want you to understand what the state of Israel means to all of us. That the Jewish people's army will never again allow a Holocaust against the Jewish people, and everything from October 7th until today must be viewed in that context. The war is a war of survival, fought by Jewish boys and girls who never had an opportunity to save their people in 1939, but who, on October 8th, closed down their law practices, shut down their dentist offices and their doctor's offices, closed down their businesses. They took their rifles, they kissed their wives and their children goodnight, and they went to bleed and die for their country in Gaza. That is the army of the Jewish people, and don't ever forget it. So we're super honored to have two wonderful guests tonight, and I want to start with Josh, who just wrote a lovely new book, which I got to read on the flight to Israel, and it's an amazing book, and I really commend you. Yasher Koach. I only have a copy that's, first of all, unsigned. Second of all, all over every page it says draft, not for dissemination. So I don't think anybody's going to be very impressed with that later on in life. But I want to start with you because I was really struck by the opening of the book where you talk about your trip to Kfar Aza, one of the kibbutzes that was devastated on October 7th. And you talk about what you saw there. And you describe this inflection point in history that we're in. this existential moment, not just for the Jews, but for Western civilization. And as you say, and I quote, the anti-Semitism after October 7th says less about the Jews than it does about the West. Talk to us about why that trip was so important and about what you meant by that comment.
Okay, so a lot in there, obviously. So thank you, Judge, for being here. Very difficult opening remarks to follow, by the way. Powerful stuff. You know, I guess before diving into the substance, you know, Rabbi Lipsker, I don't see right now, but I told him when I saw him here. There he is. So I used to live like three blocks from here. I actually was a fairly active member of the synagogue. This is my first time having to drive here and park here, actually. So, you know, between like the Federalist Society, which I've been a member of since my first year of law school, and this community here, I kind of feel like George Costanza and Seinfeld. It's very much like a worlds colliding kind of moment. But in any event. Yeah, so the book does open. Those of you who picked up a copy, and perhaps there are still some copies there in the back for those of you who have not done so. So the book opens actually in Poland, at Treblinka. And then it quickly transitions to Kfar Aza, to the Gaza envelope, the communities that were hit there. And Judge Altman, I guess I'll put it to you this way. You've been down to those communities, I think, right? Okay.
Just was there on Thursday.
Okay. So I was there in January 2024, so just you know, 3 months, I guess, after October 7th. And I'm not sure what it's like right now, but I presume it's very similar. The IDF had basically preserved the entire community.
Still.
Okay. So there's blood on the walls, there's children's toys strewn all about there. One of the homes where the family of the deceased allows you to walk into the home. You can go in there and they have like the final WhatsApp message of the couple before they were murdered on the wall for you to read. They translated from Hebrew into English there. I mean, to say like your heart sinks to the ground, I think would be an understatement there, right? I mean, this is like one of those real you know, like existential crisis moments. But to your point, Judge, and this is really kind of the spirit of the Jewish people, and I have this in the book, is right in that moment there, as like, I'm obviously crying, but I'm like, my head's like feeling like I'm about to explode with anger at the same time there. You start to hear the strumming of a guitar. And my friend Matthew, sitting right here, was actually with me. We were there together that day. And I start following the music of the guitar. And you walk to the end there, and you see 2 or 3 Haredi Jews. You know, the media will tangentially call it ultra-Orthodox, but Haredi Jews. And they're there with the sit-sits and the guitars, and they're just singing, smiling ear to ear, playing beautiful Jewish songs. And I slowly matriculate over there. People in my group start to walk over there. We happen to be there the same day as a lot of soldiers in the IDF, in the military. And they all start walking over there as well. And within 60, 90 seconds, we're all forming a huge circle, kind of swaying side to side, singing, crying, like, I'm Yisrael Chai, all these, like, and that, I mean, that is the spirit of the Jewish people right there. It is even, you know, Psalm 23, even though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. I mean, that is Psalm 23. But I fear no evil because we are the people of one God. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Eloheinu, Hashem Echad. There is one God, and He is there. So that was just one of the most powerful moments I probably had in my entire life. And to your broader question about kind of the post-October 7th milieu, it's never about the Jewish people, ever. I mean, literally, the oldest instance of anti-Semitism that I can identify, at least, is with Pharaoh in ancient Egypt and the oppression of Jews. I mean, that probably is the world's first instance of anti-Semitism, right? Is Pharaoh's kind of subjecting the Jews to slave labor. But it's never actually about the Jews. It wasn't about the Jews then. It wasn't about the Jews in Roman times. It wasn't about the Jews for the Nazis, the Soviets, anyone. It always is about something else. Anti-Semitism is here, there, and everywhere, symptomatic of a broader social and spiritual collapse in a given society there. And that's why it's no accident that in this post-October 7th environment, when you see these little Hamasniks and little campus jihadis running around campus, you know, folks at Columbia that are, you know, praise God, getting shut down these days, you know, you see them in their moments of candor. They're not even talking about the Jews. I I mean, for instance, the so-called SJP chapter, the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Columbia University, this past academic year, they literally had an Instagram post saying, "We stand for the destruction of Western civilization." I mean, they're kind of letting the cat out of the bag here, right? I mean, there's the old saying, first the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. And we've seen any number of very clear, unambiguous manifestations of that since October 7th there. So it's never about the Jews. The Jewish people are not going anywhere. We've been around for a very long time. We have God to thank for that, and we're not going anywhere. And again, this really is not about the Jews, it's about the West, and that's really why I wrote this book ultimately. It's not necessarily specifically for the Jews, although it's for them as well, obviously, but I wrote this book ideally to try to do one tiny, tiny thing to try to save Western civilization.
Dr. Cole, you've written, I've loved your writings on the constitutional period, the founding and the founding fathers, and you've written an article about the extent to which the Roman Senate influenced the structure of our Senate. And I guess your point is most scholars believe nowadays that influence has been somewhat overstated. But I think you point out that the Roman system of government had other, maybe more fundamental influences on our governmental structure, influences like bicameralism and mixed government. And I wonder if we could just tie it into what Josh is talking about, whether you agree that we're at a kind of inflection point in history, and whether you think that maybe is because we've moved away from some of these more ancient traditions, and whether a return to classicism you think might be the solution.
There's so much to unpack in all of that.
All right, well then I'll answer.
No, but thank you, and thank you both for those opening remarks. So when I was 18, 19, 20, an undergraduate, I was studying Greek and Roman history, mainly as an undergraduate. But I got an opportunity one summer to come to the United States. It was 2000. I hadn't really had any interest in American history up until that point. In fact, when I, after that summer, went back to Oxford and told my tutor that I wanted to take my final option in American history because I thought I was going to write a doctorate on America and the classics. He walked me all the way around the quadrangle of my college, University College in Oxford, a couple of times and said, "Nicholas, serious men do European history." But I'd come to America that summer, and you can't but be struck by the classical symbolism in Washington, D.C. and in other state capitals around the world. And one particular thing stood out. It was a piece of political ephemera in the year 2000. I was doing an internship on Capitol Hill, and all around the corridors there was this blue background poster with George Washington dressed in a toga on the poster, and just the caption, "How would he vote?" And it was left over from the sort of impeachment hearings. And I was really struck that there was so much in that poster. Didn't have to say anything else, but you knew exactly who had put the posters up and why and what the message was. So I came back to Oxford and very excitedly said to some of my tutors, I think I want to write a doctorate on American history. I had a great classics tutor who was called Miriam Griffin, who was somebody who'd read history in America and then come over to Oxford and stayed and become one of Oxford's greatest philosophers and ancient historians. And she thought this was great and really encouraged me. But I went to the modern history faculty and said, I think I want to do this. And they said, there's absolutely nothing in it. People have looked. There's nothing there to see. Which struck me as really odd because you can't read anything written in the last 200 years about American politics, but the classics are there. The classical symbolism is there. And a lot of modernists had a look at this and said, yeah, it's just window dressing. All of the basic ideas in America come from somewhere else. And then on the other side, some very overexcited classicists will write books that say, you can explain everything in America with Greek and Roman history. And I thought, well, neither of these things could be correct. The classicists must be wrong that everything can be explained if you just know enough Greek and Roman history, but also the modernists must be wrong that there isn't an influence there. So I started to think about, well, how do we methodologically think about what it means to have influence? We know what the founding generation was supposed to read in college. We know they often didn't do their reading because John Adams says in his diary as a young man when he gets out of college, I really wish I'd read Homer. First year reading, he was supposed to have read it. He actually joins a book club that he sets up. They agree to fine each other for not turning up. It's wonderful. And he resolves he's going to read Homer within the year. I don't think he ever does. What he does instead is start writing some of the pamphlets that become some of his revolutionary writings. But there's something in all of that. So we know what they should have read. We know sometimes what they did read. We know what they collected in libraries. But we also know, that the Roman Senate, just to pick up on the Senate, at its height was, for the Republic, maybe about 400, 500, 600 people. In the empire, swelled to about some 900 at one point. The founders of America knew this. The original US Senate was 26 people if all the states ratified. This is not the same body institutionally as the Roman Senate in many, many ways, but they always write about it as if it is, and there's this deeper logic that they want to talk about, and they want to talk about, well, why would you have a Senate if you've got a House of Representatives? What's the function of the body? So I became very interested in saying, well, look, it's clearly not correct that American institutions are neatly modeled on Roman institutions. They're much more similar to English institutions, but they are re-understood through the lens of ancient history. And that's where I think this connects then to your book, because here's the existential question for America's founders. They knew that every previous republic had been fragile and had ultimately fallen, and that the last time a big republic had fallen was around 2,000 years before the founding of America. So sometimes when you let this stuff go, it stays dead for a long time. It took about 2,000 years, America's founders thought, to claw back to having a republic on a large scale again. And this really worried them. So they were really concerned to think through what Greece and Rome had done right and what they'd done wrong, and to think through their institutions in that light. It doesn't necessarily mean that they copied ancient institutions, but they definitely used them as a kind of benchmark, as a way of framing how they thought through how their institutions would function. And not just to be cute, but because they thought the success of the American project, and therefore the idea of free Republican government globally, depended on getting it right. And that's what they put on every dollar bill on the back of it. Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages. It's a line from Virgil. And it's saying, this is important for the future of the world. Founding of America, the fact that America might get this right is the most significant thing to happen in 2,000 years. And they thought of it in existential terms. And I think that's really the connection. So,
thank you, Dr. Cole. We've been talking about Roman and Greek influences on our constitutional tradition, but at least the beginning of your book is about, he said the word ancients. Yeah. But in our discussion, the Greeks and the Romans, that was just yesterday. Yeah. Your view is, actually, we should look further back, and we should look for our constitutional framework and traditions all the way to the biblical period and the Talmudic period. You even say we should go back to Moses' on Mount Sinai and God's revelation of the law to the Israelites. Tell us about why you feel that way.
You know, I was doing a Federalist Society talk at Michigan State in East Lansing, Michigan, maybe about a week and a half ago or so. And right before I walked into the classroom there, for a totally unrelated event, this is a conversation about big tech and free speech and whatnot there. But right across the hall from the classroom, I noticed that there was a sculpture frieze, I'm not sure how you would describe it, of Moses next to this imitation of a tablet. And I was kind of struck in that moment that, that this public university, Michigan State, has not been sued by the ACLU, whatever there. To this day, the United States Supreme Court, as you obviously know, Judge, I mean, they have Moses, the original lawgiver, right there. To my knowledge, that has not been struck down on erroneous First Amendment grounds or anything like that yet. In the introductory remarks that we heard here, I mean, there was reference to the Liberty Bell, Leviticus 25 there. I mean, there's too many examples to possibly count there. But my reading of American history is essentially as follows. I read the American founding as, it's kind of a paradox a bit, because yes, we broke away from Britain, obviously, and we had rather choice words for King Charles. But on the other hand, we really did borrow a lot. We really did borrow quite a lot from our English forebears. I mean, one of these great debates at the time of the American founding was actually whether or not America would even inherit the English common law in the first place. You had kind of the more Francophilic, more pro-continental European wing of the American founding, led by Thomas Jefferson and so forth, who vociferously argued against adopting the common law. And then on the other hand, you had kind of what would become the Federalist Party in America's first two-party system, kind of the John Adams wing of the founding, who were more Anglophilic there. And long story short, they won. I mean, Louisiana is the only state today that does not have the common law, something I know all too well from having clerked on the Fifth Circuit. That was a bit of a mess, to be honest with you. But then you have to go back and look at the common law. I mean, where does the common law actually come from? Well, among other things, I mean, Justice Joseph Story, in his commentaries, writing in the mid-19th century, tells us actually, pretty much verbatim, that Christianity was part of the English common law. And this might be something that the professor and I might disagree a little bit about on, but you can go back all the way at least really to the 14th century to a man by the name of John Fortescue. I'd be very impressed if more than a handful of you have heard of him. In many ways, kind of the original godfathers, you might say, of the Anglo-American conservative tradition. Centuries before Edmund Burke, there was a man named John Fortescue, and he actually wrote quite harshly of the Roman law, believe it or not, there, but he actually wrote very favorably of the Hebrew Bible and of Scripture there. And another great titan of the Anglo-American conservative tradition, a man by the name of John Selden, who was actually imprisoned for a little while in the Tower of London in the 1600s there. This man was a pious Christian, but he was called Rabbi Selden because he was so deeply philo-Semitic. He taught him.
Did you say Sheldon or Selden? I'm sorry.
Selden. But he was a genuine Talmudic scholar. And in many ways, much of kind of the political philosophy of the Hebrew Scripture ends up being incorporated into the common law. And when I speak of the political philosophy of Hebrew Scripture there, some of the lawyers here might be familiar with my work in a jurisprudential arena and my theory that I call common good originals, and this is kind of where all this kind of overlaps together here. The philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, really of halacha, of Jewish law, to me, it's not an ultra-individualistic political philosophy. Now, to be clear, we obviously have Genesis 1:27, in Hebrew would say B'Tselem Elohim, to the Catholics, Imago Dei, this notion that God made man in his image, male and female, who created him. To be clear, I argue in the book that Genesis 1:27 is the single foundational ethical imperative for all of Western civilization. So I am not downplaying in any way individualism. On the other hand, what I am saying is that there is a very strong communitarian, we really might call it common good aspect. I mean, right there at the revelation at Mount Sinai, the world-altering event with the mountain hovering there and the Israelites accept the covenant, what does God say? He says, I shall make you a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. nation, and kingdom. He's not talking there about you will individually be holy. When it says in Leviticus, you shall be holy because the Lord your God is holy there, it's talking about this collective sense, collective holiness there. And it's kind of this synthesis between the communitarian common good impulse and individualism there. That tension, I think, plays out in the political theory of the American founding there. And more generally speaking, kind of getting away from political theory a little bit, just talking about history itself. I mean, so many of the American founders viewed themselves through kind of an Israelite-adjacent covenantal mentality, you might say. So for instance, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson famously wanted the national seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea. That's the cover of my book, obviously. Even well before that, this is kind of a fun anecdote that I actually learned while researching for the book. I honestly had not even heard this before. So well before the American founding, going back all the way to 1620, the sailing of the Mayflower across the Atlantic Ocean. I love this story. This is one of my very favorite parts of the book, to be honest with you. So Sir William Bradford is the man who was the captain of the Mayflower. He would become the second governor of Plymouth Colony. He was a student back home in England of a man by the name of Sir Henry Ainsworth. And Henry Ainsworth was a late 16th century, early 17th century Christian Hebraist. What do I mean by Hebraist? Someone who was a scholar, a student of the Hebrew Scriptures, who was deeply familiar with the Old Testament, with what Jews call the Torah, and taught himself a lot of Hebrew there. And it turns out that there were actual conversations on the Mayflower. They discussed the possibility of actually just ditching the English language and just speaking Hebrew when they landed ashore there, because they really wanted this clean separation from the past. In fact, Sir William Bradford taught himself over 1,000 words of Hebrew. And they viewed themselves crossing the Atlantic Ocean very much as the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. So it gets actually even better than that. So apparently, when Sir William Bradford then lands at Plymouth Colony, the Mayflower miraculously lands safely there, what does he do? Well, he gets down and he prostrates himself. He thanks the Creator of the world, for having landed the ship safely. So, Judge, this is not a unanimous opinion, but there are some legitimate scholars and historians who actually think that in that moment, and that moment, to be clear, became Thanksgiving, right? So there are some people who think that in that moment, what Sir William Bradford was actually doing was he was imitating a semi-obscure Jewish prayer that the Jews here will recognize, called Birkat HaGomel, which is the Thanksgiving blessing that is said, among other times, when you successfully cross a body of water. So, if I were to fly from here to Europe, whatever, I would say Birkat HaGomel. So there are some historians who actually think that Sir William Bradford had read about this prayer and was just trying to imitate that there. So, the next time that you're watching the Dallas Cowboys and eating turkey, whatever there, maybe this very obscure Jewish prayer gave you that. There's too many examples possibly to count there. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, famously speaking, in Trenton, New Jersey in February 1861, looking for kind of national succor and strength on the eve of this horrific civil war, famously describes Americans as an almost chosen people. There's this really, really beautiful anecdote, and I'll stop after this, but there's this beautiful, beautiful anecdote of, I believe it's 1862 or 1863 during the Civil War, and General USS Grant tragically issues a very deeply anti-Semitic decree, basically kicking all the Jews out of a certain regiment in Illinois or Indiana, somewhere around there. And he ends up recanting it. He basically says, my bad, so good for him. But before he took it back, you had about 10 Jews or so who rode into Washington, D.C. on horse and buggy. And I guess this is like the time where you could literally ride your horse and buggy to the White House and get a sit down with the President of the United States. So they're in the room with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, who was a famously private person, the only person he ever described as one of his very close friends was a Jewish lawyer by the name of Jonas. And so Lincoln's in this room with these Jews who were just expelled from his army. And the Jewish soldier, a man by the name of Caskell, comes to him and says, we need your help. And Lincoln says, so the children of the stock of Abraham have come to Abraham to seek help. And they say, yes. And he says, and help they shall have at once. And he countermands the order. So there's more stories like that than I could possibly count there, but that's just a little.
Well, talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about Adams.
Sure.
We obviously, I think everybody knows George Washington's
Sure.
letter to the Jewish community in
Sure.
Rhode Island, but you also talk, I think, pretty beautifully about Adams's view of the Jews, Alexander Hamilton's view of the Jews. Talk to us about why these founders respected and admired the Jews in that way.
Sure. So let me just read two of these quotes, and it's a little too long to memorize, so I hope you'll forgive me just for reading here, and then I'll talk about that. So John Adams, this is a more obscure letter. In 1809 letter, he wrote to a man named Francois Adrien van der Kemp. So this is John Adams writing, quote, "I will insist that the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of the other sect, who believe or pretend to believe that all is ordered by chance, I should believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate to all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization." And Alexander Hamilton's quote is actually arguably even better here. He once wrote, quote, "The state and progress of the Jews from their earliest history to the present time has been so entirely out of the ordinary course of human affairs. Is it not then a fair conclusion that the cause also is an extraordinary one? In other words, that it is the effect of some great providential plan. The man who will draw this conclusion will look for the solution in the Bible. He who will not draw it ought to give us another fair solution." So what Hamilton is basically saying, by the way, some people think that Alexander Hamilton actually was Jewish. That's a minority historical opinion, but he did study with a Jewish teacher growing up. He knew the Ten Commandments at a very, very young age and so forth there. But what Hamilton's basically saying there is that the Jewish people still being here are proof of God's existence. Benjamin Disraeli famously says something very similar, a century or so later, or less than that. And I mean, you heard it there in the Adams quote, Judge, but these people, these great men understood that all that they were doing stood on the shoulders of a political, moral, and ethical tradition without which our great experiment in order liberty simply would not be possible. I mean, it really is no more complicated than that. I mean, they genuinely understood, as George Washington put it in one speech there, that not just kind of abstract morality, but actual revealed biblical religion genuinely is the guarantor of man's ultimate happiness and the ultimate guarantor of a sound and stable society there. So that really is what it is, honestly.
Dr. Cole, I want to talk to you about, on that theme, Thomas Jefferson. Talk to us a little bit about Thomas Jefferson's contradictions. He obviously is probably one of the founders that we associate more than any other with a love of classical literature, poetry, art, and music. You just have to look at Monticello or the University of Virginia to appreciate his affinity for the classics. At the same time, as you note, he specifically disavowed any influence by the classics, especially Rome, on the political structure in the United States. I think you quote him as saying they knew a lot about individual freedom, but not a lot about the political structure that we're trying to implement here. Talk to us about Thomas Jefferson's view of the classical influence on America.
Yeah, so Jefferson loved paradoxes. And actually, if you read his thought on all manner of things, he really loves finding a paradox and putting himself in the middle. He's just one of the people that likes that kind of thing. So I think he really did love the fact that he was well known in his generation for being one of the sort of best classicists among the founding generation. And yet he was also the person that was perhaps most skeptical when people reached for classical text to explain American politics. And that was partly because he thought that people didn't make enough of modern innovation. And in fact, many people, Madison and Hamilton in the Federalist, both say modern innovations are essential to the success of the American political experiment. Representative assemblies, for example, are unknown in the ancient world. You have to sort of reach a very long way to sort of find a principle of representation in the ancient world. And so separation of powers as well, had been much more refined by modern thought than by classical thought. What Jefferson was very skeptical about was when people thought about political theory, they tended to reach for the ancient theory of mixed government to contrast sort of aristocratical and democratical elements in the Constitution. And Jefferson, who believed above all in popular government and popular sovereignty, thought that this tended to lead people astray, and that a sort of admiration for the classics led them to think about their institutions in a way that he disapproved of. But then he disapproved of some of the design of American institutions. He's not a member of the Federalist Party. He doesn't believe in tempering democratic control in the way that the Federalists thought that it was just an essential part of a modern structure. So Jefferson watched people like John Adams drawing lessons from ancient political theory about how to set up stable government. And Jefferson, in some ways, just had a much cruder political theory where he just said, no, we should just trust to elections and very simple forms of representative government. And yet, he's the person who designed the first state house to be built in America on classical lines, and set that model for American governmental buildings. He absolutely thought that the classics should be taught in university and studied by everybody, and gives lots of reasons for it. So he did rather revel in this rather paradoxical view of the ancient world, where on the one hand, he told his contemporaries, stop looking to the ancient world for political lessons, because you're being misled by the language in them. There's a wonderful correspondence with John Adams in their retirement where they argue about this. And John Adams says, well, you deliberately misunderstood what I was trying to write. I never meant aristocracy on the British model. I always meant it on the Greek model. And they end up agreeing that if John Adams had just written the ancient Greek word, they wouldn't have had a problem. If John Adams had just written, hoi aristoi instead of the aristocracy, that he and Jefferson would have understood each other. Sort of realization comes too late for them all. But despite warning his contemporaries not to try and study too much ancient political theory, he insists it should be part of the curriculum. He insists it's essential for, all students, if they want to understand the fundamentals of their subjects. He thinks that you should study ancient texts. When he's organizing books in a library, he organizes them by themes, and the classics are normally the first section of each part of the library.
But not so much the Bible?
So I'll come to the Bible in a second. But then he, in the symbolism, he loves classical symbolism and does more than anybody else, arguably, to really set America down this path of associating government and institutions with classical symbols. So he is a real paradox. The Bible, Jefferson had a difficult relationship with Scripture, as you know. But he twice in his life, and one time slightly gratuitously, in French, Latin, Greek, and English, cut up the New Testament with a penknife. So he bought multiple copies of the Bible in 4 languages and cut out the verses he thought were true from the New Testament and pasted them together as a sort of life of Jesus, based on his own sense of what he thought was historically correct. So he has a difficult relationship with Scripture in that way, and that got him into terrible trouble in his own time. his religious views were not a political asset, if we can put it like that. He was suspected of some real heresy, and his political opponents did go after him for it. So.
Josh, we've talked a lot about Jewish nationalism together, and I think we agree on it to a large extent. You write in the book, though, that Jewish nationalism, as manifested in the modern Jewish state of Israel, it's not just important for Jews and Israelis, it's important for the West and for America. Can you talk to us about what you mean?
So my argument, Judge, as you know from reading the book, is that ancient...
A draft of the book.
Yes. And to be clear, I'm happy to sign...
And unsigned.
I'm happy to sign this draft for you. Ancient Israel is the world's first nation state. Period, full stop. That's the historically, and I think even modern times politically salient point. When you look back and you think about the unification of the Kingdom of Israel, the Kingdom of Judah, in Jerusalem, with King David ultimately there. This was the world's first nation state. I mean, what is it? What is a nation state, right? A nation state is ultimately the unification of various tribes and congregations, and those tribes and congregations are themselves comprised of families. And you have to have some overarching similarity in order to cohere as one people in a national sense there when it comes to inherited customs and traditions, language, way of life, and so forth there. But biblical Israel really was the world's first nation state. And, they didn't have imperial ambitions. They weren't looking to conquer extraterritorially for a very simple reason, which is that their borders had literally been decreed by God. They knew what the borders were because it was told. It was literally passed down as early as the Abrahamic covenant in the book of Genesis. And I think you can contrast this biblical nation state model, the kind of ancient predecessor to the modern Westphalian nation state, this post 1648 system of independent nation states there. You can contrast that with, you might call it the Roman model or the imperial model in ancient times there. And my Edmund Burke Foundation colleague Yoram Hazony in his 2018 book Virtue of Nationalism talks a lot about this contrast, this dichotomy between the nation state, modern nationalism, and imperialism. And I think the upshot, Judge, is that if you care about the nation state, which I think you should, I am an American nationalist, I believe in nationalism, I think the world is best ordered where you have a series of independent nation states as opposed to various manifestations of empire, whether those are totalitarian evil regimes such as communism or Nazism, or whether they are slightly less overtly evil, but the kind of softer totalitarianism, you might call it, of transnational institutions, the Davos, United Nations, Brussels, whatever you want to think of it as there. In contrast to this harder or softer form of transnationalism, the nation state is really quite appealing. I mean, frankly, if we're kind of bringing it into very modern politics here, I think this is largely the appeal of the Trump phenomenon, is that Trump is nothing if not an overt nationalist. I mean, you can say whatever you want about him, you can love him or hate him there, but he's definitely an unapologetic nationalist. And again, if you care about the nation state, if you don't want to see the nation state subsumed by various universal ideologies, and in the book I identify at least three, and those three are wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism. The first two are pretty self-explanatory. Wokeism, as the famous Supreme Court opinion on pornography says, you know it when you see it, right? I mean, that's wokeism. Islamism, self-explanatory, and global neoliberalism here. What I'm talking about is it's kind of the John Lennon Imagine song taken to its logical imperative, right? I mean, I imagine a world where there are no borders, no religion. It's this homogenizing imperative. What Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum refers to as the Great Reset, this idea that there's going to be kind of a one-size-fits-all homogenization. Well, if you reject that, again, if you think the world is best governed by a series of independent nation states, then I think that you should root that advocacy in the biblical ancient Israeli model, and then taking that into modern times, it's really only a half a step further to understand that one of the many reasons that the modern state of Israel is so in the crosshairs of all these institutions is because of that symbolism. A lot of it, to be clear, is obviously just good old-fashioned rank anti-Semitism. A lot of it is the kind of Marxist understanding that you go after the Jews as a way to go after all of Christendom and Christianity. To be clear, that's part of it as well. But one of the reasons that the modern state of Israel is so in the crosshairs of all of these deeply globalist institutions, the United Nations and so forth there, really is because at a deep historical and symbolic level, it's not just that it is the world's only Jewish state, which it is, but it also is the OG nation state. I genuinely do feel that is actually a piece of the puzzle as well. So it follows that if you want to preserve the nation state, you really ought to care about preserving the state of Israel.
Dr. Cole, I just want to get back to this issue of the extent to which the classics informed the structure of, for instance, our Senate. And the issue I want to talk about is, I get that it wasn't everything, but the problem I have is, I think in reading a lot of what the founders said, they recognized that there had to be some check on tyrannical absolute power. They talked about Julius Caesar's rise and fall, Nero, Caligula, Commodus, and everything that came after. To what extent is the Senate, although maybe to some degree derived more closely from the colonial tradition, from the British Empire, to what extent does it find its roots in a fear of tyranny at the Roman level?
So there are different sorts of tyrannies. You can have a tyranny where you have a single person with too much power, and obviously that worried America's founders. But they were also very worried as well that that the people might want to vote in any given moment for unwise things, and this was a real problem in their thought. Now, somebody like Jefferson was tempted to say, well, the people should just have what they want whenever they say they want it, because there's nothing else to appeal to. And Josh, I like your book for its sort of investigation of, well, what do you base political moralities on? And I think I've also read an unsigned draft copy, but
you're not about that.
No, I didn't feel bad about it. Okay. But then I've only just met you. Most people in the founding moment were not Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson has an unusual trust for a member of his generation in the idea that the people are just going to want the right thing all the time. Most other people like James Madison, people like John Adams, realize that people can get hot-headed. They can get caught up in partisanship. They can be misled by demagogues. All of these things that they write about. And they wanted to try and square this circle. They wanted to say, well, how do we have a state where we can genuinely say that the people govern, but we can also avoid some of the things that ancient republics did that gave democracy a bad name. Athens voted to put Socrates to death. This remained a stain on the Athenian people and a stain on democracy. They voted, this was a war crime in the ancient world, they voted one afternoon to completely exterminate another city that they just defeated. And then they woke up the following morning and they said, no, we've changed our mind about that, and they had to send messengers out after the first set of messengers to say, And Athens got democracy a very bad name for doing what was thought of later as very hot-headed things in the moment. So Madison comes up and he draws on classical political theory to really crystallize this in his mind. He comes up with this idea that the American people should be given what they want if they say they want it for long enough. He has this sort of theory of politics and time where he says, look, if the American people keep telling you that they want something, then they should get it. And his mechanism for that was a Senate. And he says, you know, in the ancient world, all long-lived republics had some form of Senate. Their senates were less good than the Senate that we've come up with. So ancient senates used to be appointed for life normally. The American Senate is not going to be. And of course, it's got this complicated system where you can't, in any single election, overturn all the membership of the Senate. And Madison thought that this was critical to providing a kind of stability and order in the American system, but also avoiding the danger of democracy, which was that the people might want in a particular moment a very unwise thing. And he had a theory that was again drawn from classical philosophy about why that was the case. We tend to use the word passion to be as a good thing. We tend to say, oh, I'm very passionate about whatever. But for most people before the 19th century, and certainly for people like Madison who'd read a lot of the classics, your passions are the things that cloud your judgment and your reason. And so he had this idea that you had to give the political situation time for passions to burn themselves out. And it was only over a more extended period of time that you could really trust that what the people were telling you they wanted is their rational and well-informed sense of what they should have. Now, some people didn't like that. Jefferson didn't like that. And other people said, you know, well, actually, no, we have a much more simple idea of Republican government, and the people should just have what they want when they say they want it. But this classically informed view of Republican government does inform the idea of having bicameralism, the idea of having people elected in different ways who provide some kind of check, even within the legislature, on each other. And I think although you know it was a cheap European shot even at the time to say that the Americans had just adopted a sort of cheap version of the House of Lords after independence, but that's not how Madison and John Adams understood it, or Hamilton. They understood it as trying to give form to this classical idea that yes, the people should ultimately govern, but it should be tempered with some mechanism to make sure that the state was not overcome by passion in any particular moment. And I think all of that is very hard to understand unless you understand the classical foundations of all of that thought, unless you understand that they were suspicious of emotion as opposed to reason, and they were suspicious of popular assemblies that didn't have proper checks, and all of these other things. So I do think that, no, they might not have copied the precise sort of institutional forms of the ancient world, but they understood the institutions they were building very much in classical terms.
Josh, we're running out of time, so before I get each of you my last question, I want you to talk about what I thought was one of the more interesting parts of the book, which is this perceived contradiction between science and faith, and what you view as a general misconception about the inflection point there.
Well, I mean, this is a topic, Judge, that's been written about, you know, so often over the millennia. You know, people make this out to be a false choice. On the one hand, you have empiricism. On the other hand, perhaps you have rationalism or human reason there. On the other hand, of course, you have the Bible and revealed religion, and it's obviously a false choice. I mean, there's any number of examples of personally pious scientists over the centuries. I mean, Sir Isaac Newton would be but one very famous example. He was a devout Christian himself there. Any number of Orthodox Jewish scientists who have risen to prominence here in both the United States and Israel there. But, you know, Judge, I think even more to me than this kind of science-faith dichotomy, and I explore this a little bit in one of the early chapters there, is this notion of reason versus religion. So you have on the one hand the classic Straussian formulation, so Leo Strauss, for those of you who are not, you know, less familiar. So Leo Strauss, the 20th century political philosopher, famously argues the Western civilization is more or less this double helix, this DNA-like double helix, of two strands, where you have revelation, going back to Mount Sinai and then Jerusalem, and then reason in the Greco-Roman tradition there. And one of the things that I argue, and probably one of the more provocative points that I try to make early on in the book there, is I actually genuinely do not think that these two things are equal. I actually think that without revelation, then pretty much everything is lost. There are too many examples to count of societies going back thousands and thousands of years that just claim that they are doing something smart or reasonable or rational, and it leads to all sorts of horrific results. I mean, to use a very dramatic example there, when I was at Treblinka looking at the railroad tracks there, I think a lot of people living at the time building those railroad tracks thought that they were acting in a rational, reasonable fashion. And from a Jewish perspective, that's not to say that there is no role for reason in analysis. I would never say that. In fact, the Rambam, Maimonides, writes about this quite a bit, actually. But the key point is that reason has to be incorporated into an exogenous, pre-existing framework. To simply say that absent any context whatsoever, and kind of the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, to go back to John Rawls maybe, to kind of say that in the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, you can kind of just scratch the old noggin and say, this is reasonable there. I think that's a genuine mistake. I think that has served human beings very, very poorly who go down that rabbit hole. Frankly, one of my arguments in the book also, Judge, also is to theologically liberal Jews, my fellow Jews, actually, people who have been raised, primarily kind of a Reformed Jewish saying there, because theologically liberal Judaism oftentimes is predicated upon this overemphasis on reason and rationality there. To give, I guess while I'm dishing out provocative examples, at the very first rabbinical ordination dinner for the first Reformed Jewish seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1880s there, they famously called it the treifa banquet because they made a big show of the fact that they were eating treif, non-kosher food there. And, when you take reason and rationality, or I should say, when you take purported reason and rationality to think that you are so smart to just throw away thousands of years of tradition, to just throw away, in this case, God's word itself there, you're actually only exposing yourself as an ignoramus. Because we're made in the divine image, but we are not the divine. That is to say that we have some of his traits, but we are ultimately not him. And Judaism has this dichotomy in halachot, in Jewish law, between the reasonable, like the rational mitzvot commandments, and the unreasonable ones, referred to as the chochim. And to a certain type of Jew, you might look at that and say, why bother with the unreasonable stuff? Why bother with wrapping tefillin and phylacteries every morning? Why bother with keeping kosher there? But I think the proper way to view that is, again, because we are only a semblance of our Creator. So the fact that we can actually understand some of the commandments, that's the spark of divinity within us. That we actually are capable of intuiting or rationalizing some of them. So I think a lot of this is just viewed completely the wrong way there. But that's part of the book as well, is genuinely arguing for a full-throated embrace of biblical values in the public square. I argue in the latter chapter that so-called separation of church and state, a Jeffersonian concept, is ahistorical and frankly should be overturned. Just real quick, the notion of separation of church and state, which I'm wearing a kippah, we're in a synagogue here. I realize this is a kind of a hot topic, yeah. But it's not actually in the First Amendment, guys. And America really was founded as an ecumenical biblical country. I argue above all there. So that's part of my argument, is arguing that science, revelation, reason, none of these things are necessarily in irreconcilable tension with one another there. But in contrast to prevailing societal trends there, if I had to name one of those three that is the most important to actually reclaim Western civilization, I genuinely do think that it actually is revealed religion.
Dr. Cole, last question for you. You talk about the rise and fall of Rome, where Athens went astray, Sparta gets gobbled up. Josh thinks we're at this critical existential moment in our history, our own history. I wonder if looking back at great empires that have risen and thrived and fallen, whether you agree, and whether you think that looking to the classics and at their example is an important way for us to counteract maybe the barbarians at the gate.
So I said Jefferson thought that people should study the classics. Most of his generation would have agreed that there was a curriculum that citizens should study, and that it should include, for example, law and legal texts, Roman law, the common law. It should include scripture. It should include a series of other things. It should include science. We talk about the liberal arts, don't we? I wonder how many people remember why we call the liberal arts the liberal arts. Well, for Jefferson's generation, they understood very clearly that there was a body of knowledge that was worthy of free people, necessary for free people. I think we've got a number of inflection points right now. There are people on both the right and the left in this country and in mine and globally that do not believe in liberal democratic government. There's a environmental movement that's very popular with young people in Britain called Extinction Rebellion, and they go and sort of superglue themselves to trains and lie down in the road in London and young people are fired off about this because they're very worried about the environment, but they don't read the group's manifesto, and the group's manifesto says liberal deliberative democracy has failed and we need something else. And we could go around the world and we could pick out all of the people that do not think that the liberal republics that were founded in America are actually the right way of governing the world. And at the same time, the history of the law, the history of Parliament, the history of how we came to have the institutions we have has essentially fallen off the curriculum almost everywhere. Go and read the history curriculums now of, I would say this because I'm a historian, but go and read the history curriculums of leading universities, and all of the things that the founding generation thought should be taught are not really being taught in many, many places. And I think that's a very dangerous moment because you have generations growing up who literally don't have the intellectual framework to understand why the institutions that are, yes, flawed and imperfect in all kinds of ways, were shaped the way that they are shaped. They don't understand how difficult it was to establish a society where the rule of law exists. And so they're very, very tempted to want to throw it all out. And I think that's a very, very dangerous moment for all of us. And I'm not really sure where it ends. So I wish I could say something a little bit more optimistic in this moment.
Well, I'm certainly not happy.
But no, I do think this is a moment where I've been reflecting that only a minority of humankind have ever lived in a democratic state, and that fewer people as a percentage of humankind currently live in liberal democracies than probably did when I first visited America. So we're sort of moving back in a bad direction, and I really don't like watching that.
Josh, last question. I'm not sure you're going to give me anything less gloomy, but When you wrote the book, you talked about the U.S.-Israel relationship and its importance. But obviously, since the draft that I received, a lot has happened. And
to be clear, Judge, the draft that you received is probably verbatim the final copy.
Should I tell him? Where's Sheldon? Where's Sheldon? There's a couple of misspelled words in there, so I hope not. I hope those were edited, you know?
Okay.
But anyway, I just wanted to bring us forward. And if you had the chance to write it now, after all the things that have happened since you stopped writing, whether there are things that you think are important to include about the U.S.-Israel relationship and why it's so important, not just for Israel, not just for America either, but for the West writ large.
So I stopped drafting the book basically in the middle of the Chagim, in the middle of the Jewish holidays in October. I think it was literally between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. It was right around then. So back in October is when I actually handed in the manuscript.
That's right after the beepers, but before Nasrallah was executed?
So Nasrallah's execution was one of the final things that I added, actually.
There it is, okay.
So it was after Nasrallah. It was before
Assad falls.
Before Assad's fall in Syria. So yes, between Nasrallah and Assad, I guess you would say. Look, I think one thing on a very concrete geopolitical level in the Middle East that's happened since I finished drafting is the fall of Bashar al-Assad and the rise of this al-Qaeda adjacent jihadist group in Damascus. And I'm sure many of you have seen these absolutely horrific, truly disturbing, genuinely horrifying images and videos from this past weekend. Christians, Druze, Alawites.
Wait, I'm sorry. I didn't see the United Nations decry any of that. Did you?
I must have missed it, Judge.
What a weird thing.
Yeah.
No Jews, no news.
No Jews, no news. Exactly right there. No, that's exactly right. So one thing that's relevant when it comes to Syria is actually less about Syria. It's more about Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Turkey. Because the regime overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus is really more about kind of arguably the diminishing power of Iran in the region and the rise of Turkey. And one of the final edits that I made in the book, actually, on the advice of a friend who lives in Israel, was I had some line there where I refer to Iran as the state of Israel's only currently existential threat, and my friend counseled me and said, you should caveat that and say, for now, because Turkey has the potential to become that. Turkey's a very complicated country. Turkey's currently in NATO. The United States has nuclear weapons at Incirlik Air Base in Turkey. There is no easy way to expel a NATO country once they are in there. So this is a very, very, very thorny topic that if I had more time, I probably would have explored that a little more deeply there. But more generally speaking, not a whole lot has otherwise changed other than the election, obviously, of President Trump. And we saw what his comments on Gaza. We're patiently awaiting to see what he has to say when it comes to Judea and Samaria, the actual biblical homeland and so forth there. So I probably would have spent a little more time on that there. But look, more generally speaking, the leitmotif of the book, which goes on and on and on from the very first chapter through the very last chapter, is that the way that the Jewish people go, so goes the West. Not just the state of Israel, although that also is true, but really just the Jewish people as a whole. Anti-Semites going back forever have always understood that if your goal is something broader, you always start with the canary in the coal mine. If your goal is to overthrow all of Christendom, all that Christianity has built there, you're going to start with the original people of the book. Karl Marx understood this intuitively. He wrote about this explicitly, actually, in his deeply anti-Semitic essay on the Jewish question. Karl Marx says this basically verbatim. So if you're going after capitalism, Christianity there, it makes sense to start with the Jews there. The people, you mentioned the UN, the people voting against Israel at the UN there, they don't just hate the state of Israel there. They obviously hate the United States. They obviously hate all of our other, Westphalian nation-state style allies as well there. So if you care about defending what we call the West, first of all, you have to ask, what is the West? Because a lot of people kind of toss this term out there, Western civilization, the West there. And to me, the West is essentially synonymous with the Bible. The Bible and the Judeo-Christian tradition is the West. Pretty much period, full stop, end of story. I mean, I'm not throwing out, obviously, Athens and Rome or anything there, but the Bible was and remains the foundation of what we call the West. So if you want to turn back the tide, ultimately, against these three hegemonic universalist forces that are deeply pernicious and destructive in all of their own ways, wokeism, Islamism, and global neoliberalism there, you're going to have to actually rejuvenate and find again that which we once knew, which is that God and the nation state are at the crux of all of this there. And we have to be in this together. Jews, Christians, the biblical religions have to stand together shoulder to shoulder here. We have no other choice, Judge, because, not only do we literally share a lot of the Holy Book together, but we're in this together against the exact same enemies.
Amen.
The exact same enemies.
All right, Emily, I'm pretty much on time, plus 13 minutes or so, which for me is on time. So let's see. We have time for a few questions. We have one brave soul.
All right, so this is for the panel. We've got esteemed scholars and jurists in the room. What role should natural law have in our understanding, application, and interpretation of the Constitution as our founding document? I'll add to it that, of course, the Greeks understood it. Obviously, the Jewish law understood it. But even the Romans, in first chapter of the Institutes, the rights of persons, Justinian distinguishes between the laws given to man according to nature as opposed to the positive law. And, of course, our Declaration of Independence talks about these rights that we find self-evident 100 years later in the Reconstruction era. John Bingham pitches the amendment of the Reconstruction appealing to a set of rights that were already there, that state wasn't conferring, but were given to man by God. And we fast forward to the present day, and it seems that this whole tradition has really fallen away in understanding our original document.
Which one of us do you want to answer that question?
Well,
Obviously, he agrees with you.
Really, anyone on the panel, if you guys would like to offer in.
Well, he's written a lot about it.
I'll just say the Roman idea of natural law and the modern idea are quite different in the sense that on that first page of the Institutes, yes, there's natural law, there's the law of all nations, and then there's the law of the particular nation, but it's quite clear that you can't appeal to the natural law against the law of a nation in the framing that the Institute gives it, because Justinian says a man is made a slave by the law of all nations contrary to the natural law, for example. And he's not meaning to say by that, although he might perhaps have done better to say slavery is therefore wrong. So the hierarchy is different. For modernists, an appeal to the natural law was, of course, an appeal to morality, and to say that if a national law contradicts natural law, there is something wrong with the national law, and so that's quite a different way of thinking about the relationship of those two ideas. I suppose my only caution is this. If I don't think that the nation's law is correct, if I think it's been badly drafted or misunderstood or whatever, there's a mechanism somewhere to address that. If I don't agree with somebody's assertion about the natural law, if we just have a disagreement about that, how do we resolve that question? I've never been quite sure about that, and I'm still wrestling with that as an issue. So, and again, a little bit like Jefferson, I'm a terrible paradox in all this, because of course the thing that first fired me up about American political thought was reading Jefferson's thoughts on natural law and the Declaration of Independence and all those works, and and they're incredibly powerful, and that's what got me interested in American political thought in the first place. But now I come to think through the exact question that you are asking and that others are asking. I worry in a very practical sense about how we really work it through. But I know other people, and I know we're going to disagree about this because. At least in your draft, I think.
I don't love the term natural law because when a lot of people think of natural law, they think of the very kind of unaided, old noggin-style reason that I was just criticizing. Having said that, it ought to be obvious that there has to be something higher than the words on the page, and that is the American tradition. I mean, Alexander Hamilton, writing in his opening words of Federalist 31, says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's a close paraphrase, that in disquisitions of every kind, it is axiomatic, it is self-evident that there are certain anchoring principles upon which all subsequent analyses depend, right? So what are those anchoring principles? And look, the alternative to that is old school legal positivism. Legal positivism reaches its apex or its low points, depending on how you would think of it, I guess, at the Nuremberg trials. I mean, at the Nuremberg trials, when the Nazi war criminals are being prosecuted, basically up and down the line, what was their response? I was just following orders. I mean, if your entire legal theory is that the words on the four corners of the page are what they are, period, full stop, end of story, just following orders there, that ends in the gulags of the Soviet Union or Nuremberg. Or sometimes. I mean, it could also end well, but it depends, right? So there has to be something more there. In my own jurisprudential work, which I talk about a little bit in the book, it's not exactly a major feature. To me, it's actually very simple. The extent to which the words on a page, whether it's a statute or constitution, ought to be respected as law qua law depend upon the legitimacy of the overarching political order at kind of really at a regime level, as Aristotle or Strauss would say there. And the American constitutional order is fundamentally legitimate at a regime level because it is based on sound principles, on sound normative principles. We know that from the Declaration and from the preamble of the Constitution and so forth there. So that is why our Constitution is worth respecting as law qua law. If that counts as natural law to you, then that's fine. I would formulate slightly differently, but I'm sympathetic to the point that you make.
Thank you.
All right.
Good evening. My question is specifically directed to Josh, and it's on the geopolitics of the Middle East post the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And you mentioned that Iran is kind of Israel's sole existential threat for now. But Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey is the second biggest army in NATO. The government in Syria is sort of propped up by Turkey. Yep. Does Turkey, down the line, through this doctrine of neo-Ottomanism that seems to dominate Erdogan's foreign policy, does Turkey pose a larger threat to Israel's continued existence than Iran did maybe a couple decades down the line, given just how powerful Turkey is?
It's entirely possible, which again is why I actually tweaked one of those lines in my book at the very end to literally caveat Iran is the only existential threat for now, because Turkey easily could come to be that. Look, NATO is going to have to figure out what to do with Turkey, and I don't have a good, clean solution to this because again, I don't think it's actually possible within. There's no actual mechanism within the NATO charter for expelling a member there. At least I'm aware of. I could be wrong about that, but it's an extraordinarily difficult process at a bare minimum there. But we're gonna. At a bare minimum, like America needs to get its nuclear weapons out of Incirlik Air Base. I mean, that's pretty nuts that we have a massive nuclear arsenal there, right there in Turkey. Turkey. They're already a major threat, right? And they're only going to become a bigger one over time. Erdogan is obviously maybe not fully rigging, but at least partially rigging his elections there. I mean, the notion that he's won all these free and fair elections for 20, 30 years there, I think is nuts there.
All by 90%.
Yeah, right.
That's like the only number in the machine that pops out.
I do have a follow-up about that because, in the last 5 years, the Republican People's Party, the CHP, has come relatively close to winning elections, although, these are 52-48 style contests, right. But it seems to me like there's some funny business going on for Erdogan. Right. If the CHP were to come back into power and Erdogan's Islamist brand were defeated, is there any hope that we have a different panorama in the Middle East for Israel and Turkish relations? If
Erdogan were to go, you're saying?
Yes, and if his party were to be defeated by liberals, so to speak.
I think that would be a tremendously positive development. From my perspective. Turkey. You sound like you're a very knowledgeable guy. So as you probably know, Turkey was founded as a secular state. I mean, that was kind of the entire purpose
Well,
of
it was a close ally of Israel for a long time.
Yeah. So, I mean, more generally speaking, the entire Middle East geopolitical map is actually kind of reversed versus what it was for the first 20, 30 years of Israel's existence. I mean, Turkey and Iran, under the Shah, were two of Israel's closest allies. I mean, who were Israel's worst enemies? The Sunni Arab states. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a vicious enemy, obviously, Egypt and so forth there. I mean, look at it today, it's basically flipped on its entire head, right? So, I mean, that's kind of no small irony right there. But the people of Turkey they're not this fanatical, radically Islamist population there. I mean, similar to Iran, there is a mismatch between regime and common sentiment. And when there's a drastic mismatch, the natural solution is for regime change. I'm not calling, obviously, to topple Recep Tayyip Erdogan, but ideally, there will be an election by a large enough margin that the current occupant of the White House might call it too big to rig, right? I mean, that would be the ideal solution, I think.
Thank you very much.
All right, last question.
Well, first I want to say thank you to the speakers. This was absolutely fantastic. I'm trying to reconcile some of the pessimism I've heard with some remarkable accomplishments that have recently happened in the United States. Currently, median income is not just unprecedented in the United States, but probably unprecedented for mankind, especially a country of this size for all intents and purposes. So when the barbarians were at the gates of other major civilizations before they fell, did they see such unprecedented metrics? Were they the richest they ever were, and then they collapsed all of a sudden? Or were they kind of declining and then someone took them out?
Edward Gibbon wrote a book about this. It's 6 volumes. I recommend it.
Okay.
I'll let them answer.
Gibbon says, the time mankind was happiest, and I think he also meant richest, was under one of the Roman emperors. The Spartan idea was that it was better to be a bit poorer and virtuous as a society. Not everybody's always agreed with that, and Sparta was difficult even in the ancient world. The Roman aristocracy made their peace with emperors because they were doing very well. Tacitus, who's my favorite ancient historian, constantly asks the question: why didn't the Roman Senate restore the Republic? Why did they had all of these opportunities to get rid of emperors? He thinks, why didn't they do it? And the answer is, governing's difficult. Being a citizen is difficult. Making laws is difficult. Having to just leave the emperor to do it. Get on with becoming rich. That's the deal that the Roman Senate did for hundreds of years.
Congress abdicating its responsibility constitutionally to legislate, foisting on an ever larger and more powerful executive to pass laws and agency rules that govern every aspect of our being. I made a joke about Edward Gibbon, but it's very prescient because it came out in 1776. So it's all tied. And you see, when it came out, it was shocking because really he described, the thesis of the book is that Christianity made Rome fat. And Christianity comes in, 327 or so, and Rome falls in 409. So we're talking an 80-year period that he's describing. So that's pretty quick, I would say, historically. But he is clear that during that period, especially from the 100s, the 200s, the 300s, Rome is as rich as it's ever been. It's as big as it's ever been. It's governing more people than it's ever governed all over the world. The apex of the Roman Empire is in the 3rd and 4th century, just before the fall. And what happens? It's really not Christianity, by the way. It's a lack of that Spartan spirit. People get fat, they get rich, they get complacent. And now guess what? We don't fight our own wars. So we conquer the Gauls, and then the Gauls are our infantry. And then we conquer the Numidians, and then the Numidians are our cavalry. And suddenly Rome is this bizarre situation where it's off in Parthia fighting wars with no Roman soldiers on behalf of Rome. And suddenly, at some point, the soldiers get fed up and say, hey, how about we all just get together and topple our overlords? And it starts to fall from within because there's no one left in Rome to fight. And this is, I think, an important lesson too, which we can conclude on. But you see, I mentioned this at the beginning. When you go to Israel, you sit in a room like this. How many people in this room have fought in war? Zero. And yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I'm about to go put them in bed, so. But you see, an Israeli would come here, and by the way, Israelis, you go to Tel Aviv, it looks a lot like Miami, with a lot more shawarma. But in this same audience, every single person would have either fought in war or had their sons and daughters fight and die in war. And they look like us, and they act like us, and they read the same books that we do, but they don't live like us. Because the one thing you understand when you and your children and your children's children go and fight for the country and die for the country is that we're in it together. It's the old Franklin thing, right? We're either going to hang together or we'll definitely hang separately. They understand that. So there's this balance there between great individualism, and Josh talked about it, and that's important for the entrepreneurship and the businesses and the gross domestic product, but this obligation that everyone feels, one to the other. And in America, part of the problem is that we don't have that anymore. And when you look at the time of the Civil War, and actually at the time that Dr. Cole was talking about, where Adams and Jefferson are corresponding in the 1820s, these people are asking themselves, are we deserving of the people of 76? That's what they would call it. Do we have the spirit of 76? And people would say yes or no. People would say our kids do, but our grandkids don't. Well, every single day in Israel, people ask themselves, are we deserving of 48? Are we deserving of the spirit of 48? And every parent and grandparent in that country will tell you, when you go, our children and grandchildren, they're giborim. They are the greatest heroes our country has ever produced. Can we say the same about the kids who sit home and play video games all day and watch TikTok videos and go out to take over Hamilton Hall at Columbia University? Of course not. So I think there's a lot for us to learn about a country with a martial spirit, a country that's vibrant and plugged in, a country where every citizen is willing to put his and her life down and the lives of their children for the betterment and survival of everybody else. And that's how nation states survive, not by what we have going on here. Folks, please join me in thanking these wonderful panelists. Wonderful job.
Thank you. Well, I enjoyed the moderation.
That was awesome.
Thank you very much to Judge Altman, Josh Hammer, Dr. Cole. And if you didn't have a chance to get Josh Hammer's book, please grab it on the way out. And he's graciously agreed to stay back and sign copies for us. So thank you very much.